Let me tell you about Frank, a veteran who thought his toughest battles were behind him. He'd served his country with honor, facing challenges most of us can only imagine. Through years of discipline and sacrifice, Frank believed he'd earned a peaceful retirement, a chance to finally rest and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. After 20 years of service, he settled into a quiet life, fixing old furniture in his workshop. The steady rhythm of his days brought him comfort. Each morning he'd head to his garage, sunlight streaming through the window, ready to breathe new life into forgotten pieces. He loved the smell of sawdust, the satisfaction of making broken things whole. The workshop was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the hum of tools and the grain of wood, where every project was a small victory. But something changed. Stairs felt steeper, lifting a table left him breathless. The smallest tasks began to feel like mountains, and he found himself pausing more often, hands on his knees, waiting for his heart to slow. He laughed it off, blamed age, but the fatigue grew. It crept into his bones, making even the most familiar routines feel foreign and exhausting. His wife Sarah noticed the deep rattling coughs and the way he avoided things he loved. She watched him from across the kitchen, worry etched on her face as he coughed into his hand, trying to hide his discomfort. Walks to the mailbox triggered coughing fits, fishing trips and playing with grandkids became too much. He'd watch from the porch as his grandchildren played, longing to join but unable to catch his breath. The world he'd built was shrinking, and he felt a shadow creeping in. The walls of his home seemed to close in, and the silence grew heavier with each passing day. Frank tried to tough it out. He was from a generation that didn't run to the doctor. He prided himself on his resilience, determined not to show weakness even as his body betrayed him. Just a smoker's cough, he'd say, though he'd quit years ago. He'd wave off Sarah's concern with a weak smile, insisting he was fine, that it was nothing to worry about. But this was more than a cough. Breathing itself became a challenge. Each breath felt like a struggle, as if the air was growing thinner and his chest tighter. The workshop, once his sanctuary, now felt like an obstacle course. Tools he once wielded with ease now seemed heavy, and the cluttered space felt overwhelming. The simple act of breathing was no longer simple. Every inhale was a reminder that something inside him was changing, and not for the better. The storm inside him was growing louder. It was as if dark clouds were gathering, both in the sky and within his own body, signaling that something serious was coming. He didn't know its name yet. The uncertainty gnawed at him, making each day feel longer and more uncertain, but it was about to change everything. For Frank and Sarah, the first whisper of a storm was only the beginning of a journey they never expected to take. What was Frank up against? COPD, Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease. It's a long-term lung disease that blocks airflow, making it hard to breathe. COPD isn't just one disease, it's usually emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Imagine your lungs as spongy balloons with tiny air sacs. With COPD, those sacs lose their stretch, and airways get clogged. It's like trying to blow up a balloon with a blocked opening. That's why people with COPD feel so out of breath. Veterans like Frank are at higher risk, exposed to dust, fumes, chemicals, and often cigarettes. These exposures damage lungs over years, and symptoms can show up long after service. COPD is progressive. It gets worse if ignored, but it can be managed. It's not a death sentence, it's a diagnosis. With the right steps, you can slow it down and live better. For Frank, understanding the enemy was the first step to fighting back. Knowledge became his new weapon. Frank's diagnosis didn't come easy. For months he brushed aside the nagging cough and the heaviness in his chest, telling himself it was just part of getting older. He ignored the problem, powered through days, and collapsed at night, exhausted. Each morning he hoped he'd feel better, but the fatigue only grew. His world shrank as he avoided facing the truth. Friends stopped calling, and Frank found himself spending more time alone, watching the seasons change from his window. The breaking point? Struggling to carry groceries, gasping for air, Sarah's fear finally breaking his denial. She watched him, her eyes wide with worry, as he leaned against the car, unable to catch his breath. She made the doctor's appointment. This time, Frank didn't argue. He saw the concern etched on her face and realized he owed it to her, and to himself, to find answers. At the doctor's he described his symptoms: coughing, breathlessness, fatigue. He admitted how long he'd been struggling and how much it had changed his life. The doctor asked about his service, smoking, and work. Frank recounted years in the factory, the cigarettes he'd smoked, and the dust he'd breathed in. Then came spirometry, a deep breath, a hard blow into a tube, measuring lung function. Frank watched the nurse's face, searching for clues in her expression. The results were clear. "Frank, you have COPD." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, but also strangely clarifying. The diagnosis hit hard. Fear, relief, and finally clarity. At last there was an explanation for the struggle, a reason for the changes he'd felt. The invisible enemy had a name. Frank felt a strange sense of comfort, knowing what he was up against. Now they could fight it together. Sarah squeezed his hand, promising they'd face whatever came next as a team. The uncertainty was over, a new journey had begun. There would be challenges, but also hope, and a plan to move forward. Frank realized he wasn't alone. Others had walked this path before him, and he could learn from their strength and stories. He had Sarah, a plan and a path forward. Together they mapped out medications, appointments, and new routines. The long road to a name was behind him. The fear of the unknown had faded, replaced by determination. The road to managing COPD was just starting. There would be setbacks, but Frank was ready to face them, one step at a time, and Frank was ready to walk it, with hope in his heart and Sarah by his side. Getting diagnosed was one thing, living with COPD was another battle. Frank felt overwhelmed, angry, and lost. His workshop now a reminder of what he'd lost. Every cough, every wheeze chipped away at his spirit. He withdrew, snapped at Sarah, and felt like a burden. The disease wasn't just in his lungs, it was in his mind. He stopped seeing friends, avoided the VFW, and let loneliness settle in. Sarah refused to let him fade away. She reminded him, "We're in this together. COPD doesn't get to have you." Her words were a lifeline. Frank realized he had a choice. Let COPD define him, or fight back. He chose to adapt, to reclaim his life. The weight was still there, but he wasn't carrying it alone. With Sarah by his side, hope returned. The battle wasn't over, but Frank was no longer fighting it alone. Managing COPD isn't a single battle, it's a daily grind. Every morning Frank woke up knowing he'd have to face the same challenges all over again. It wasn't just about fighting symptoms, but about building habits that would help him breathe easier day after day. Frank's new routine started with medication, a rescue inhaler for emergencies, a maintenance inhaler every day. He kept his inhalers and pill organizer close, making sure nothing was missed. Each dose was a small act of self-care, a step toward stability. Learning to use them right took practice, but Sarah kept him on track. She watched his technique, encouraged him, and reminded him that every detail mattered. Together they turned a confusing process into a shared routine. Slowly, the coughing eased, and he could do more without gasping. Walks in the park became possible again, and he found himself enjoying moments he once took for granted. There were still bad days, but the good ones grew. Frank learned to savor the laughter with his family and the fresh air on his face, even if progress was slow. Consistency was key. Skipping meds meant setbacks. Missing even a single dose could undo days of hard work, so he made reminders and double-checked his supplies. Regular doctor visits became routine, with checkups and spirometry to track progress. Frank learned to ask questions, to understand his numbers, and to work with his care team. Frank kept a notebook of symptoms and questions, making each appointment count. He tracked his breathing, his energy, and any changes, determined to stay ahead of the disease. The biggest change was his mindset. Instead of feeling defeated, he found strength in small victories and refused to let setbacks define him. Managing COPD became his new mission: discipline, planning, and commitment. He approached each day with the focus of a soldier, determined to win every small battle. He wasn't a passive victim anymore, he was an active participant in his health. Frank read pamphlets, researched new treatments, and made sure he understood every aspect of his care. The daily grind became his new discipline. Each small victory mattered. Every day he stuck to his plan, he felt a little stronger, a little more in control. Frank learned to fight smart, not just hard. He adapted, learned from setbacks, and celebrated progress no matter how minor. He found purpose in the routine. The structure gave him hope, and the effort gave him pride. And that made all the difference. Frank's journey wasn't easy, but it was his own, and he owned every step. The war for his well-being was on, and every day, Frank showed up ready to fight. Medication was just the start. Pulmonary rehab changed everything for Frank. At first he was hesitant, but the program taught him practical skills. He learned pursed lip breathing, inhale through the nose, exhale slowly through pursed lips. This simple technique helped him control breathlessness and panic. Supervised exercise, even at low intensity, strengthened his muscles and made daily tasks easier. Over time, he could do more with less effort. Rehab also covered nutrition, energy conservation, and stress management. Frank reorganized his workshop, ate smaller meals, and learned to manage anxiety. It was a holistic approach, treating the whole person, not just the lungs. He graduated with a toolbox of strategies for living well. Breathing, moving, and living became possible again. Pulmonary rehab gave Frank his life back, and he never looked back. Frank learned the power of connection. For too long he carried COPD alone, but Sarah was his rock, reminding, encouraging, and supporting him. Accepting her help wasn't weakness, it was strength. Pulmonary rehab introduced him to others on the same journey. Veterans, teachers, workers, sharing tips and hope. Their stories made him feel less alone. Inspired, Frank returned to the VFW, where honesty brought understanding, not pity. He found he wasn't the only one fighting an invisible battle. The VFW became a support system, not a place of shame. Family, friends, and fellow patients became his safety net. Vulnerability became courage. COPD can be isolating, but support turns it into a shared journey. Frank's tribe made all the difference. If Frank could talk to you, he'd say, get diagnosed early, don't ignore the signs. Early treatment slows the damage and improves life. Become your own expert. Know your triggers, track symptoms, and have a plan for flare-ups. Movement matters. Motion is lotion. Even small walks or light weights help. Pulmonary rehab is like boot camp for your lungs. Ask your doctor about it. Protect your mental health. Talk about your struggles. Join a support group. Find a hobby. Focus on what you can do, not what you can't. Your attitude is a tool. Use it. Don't wait until you're gasping in the driveway. Be proactive, not reactive. Small steps add up. You're not alone. Reach out. Frank's advice is simple. Fight smart, stay connected, and never give up. Every breath is worth fighting for. You have more strength than you think. Use it. Today, Frank's life is different, but it's still his. COPD is part of his story, but not the whole story. He still works in his workshop, takes breaks, and enjoys the smell of sawdust. He goes fishing, finds new ways to play with his grandkids, and adapts to his limits. Frank's journey is about resilience, living well within new boundaries. A diagnosis isn't the end, it's a new chapter. With courage, discipline, and support, he's learned to work with his body, not against it. Small victories, like a walk without gasping, are now his measures of success. If you're facing COPD, remember Frank. There's treatment, management, and hope. The road is tough, but you can keep moving forward. Take it one breath at a time, breathing in, breathing out, carrying on. That's a job worth doing.